Hello, and welcome to Art Pop Talk. I'm Bianca.
And I'm Gianna. This week we have an incredible guest on to talk all about the money.
Money, must be funny in a rich man's world. All the things I could do if I had a little money. All right, nobody wants.
Anyways, Onyx Montes tells us all about her salary transparency project and how museums can become more transparent with their wages.
Yes, so we ask her questions all about the wage gap, why women are made to feel so afraid about talking about money, and how we can grow out of this adoration we have for an unpaid internship. So Gianna, are you ready to show me the money?
What little money I have? Absolutely.
Oh, you're too kind. Hello, sister.
Hello.
How goes it?
This technically isn't my first time recording in Tulsa. I've been up here and I've had to record, but this is my first recording session, I suppose, as an official resident.
Ooh, I love it. You're looking sleek in the new Tulsa HQ, Tulsa headquarters,
Thank you. Just got a nice little sweat glow from having to look at some apartment complexes in this treacherous heat. We were just talking about how I feel as though not much has happened today, but I was telling Bianca the highlight of my week was probably watching Luca on Disney Plus. It was so freaking cute. I really liked it.
I feel like this movie, I have yet to watch it. I'm going to watch it this weekend with Andrew, hopefully. But he was telling me this movie is just made for us, Gianna. It's about Italians. It's about mer people and sea monsters. And is that us? Is this movie about us?
The whole time.
I love to think of myself as an Italian mermaid,
You got long hair. You're like a mermaid. Bianca, when you watch it, you'll have to tell me what your thoughts. But regardless, it was really, really beautiful and just so darling. It was such so cute. But you did have a fun week or past week. You were in New York. You're back home now. And I hear we had a cutie little run-in with an art Pop-Tart.
You guys, I met an art Pop-Tart in the wild, and he was just so nice. I told him I was going to give him a shout out. So Matt, thank you so much for listening to the show. I was telling Gianna all about you. We love you so much. Thank you so much for listening. Matt was just so sweet. He was talking about how he listens to us when he's at the gym, when he's working out, and he was just telling me about his experience with different museums, and he works in theater, and it was so cool. It was such a fun conversation. And I work really hard to make the audio sound good for you guys. Like, I just need you to know how much I am working in Audacity to make our audio perfection. And he was like, your audio is so good. When I found out you weren't in the same room together, I couldn't believe it. And honestly, that just made my heart so happy. It was really, really sweet. And it was so nice, and it was just so appreciated. So just want to say hello, Matt.
For me, the highest compliment is someone listening to us at the gym, because as a fellow podcast listener, that's when I burn through all my podcasts, is when I'm at the gym, and I listen to very particular things while I'm working out if I'm not in a music mood. So I feel as though that is a very high compliment.
Truly. I feel like in the car, that's pretty high up there, but at the gym, that's whoa. You're listening to us over some, crafty beats at the gym. That's just amazing. That is so nice.
Well, for me,
we're getting you pumped up for your, hot girl, hot boy summer.
Matt's on the treadmill right now. He's on the elliptical, and he's like, oh, fuck
hello,
this is getting
and
me
welcome
through.
to Art Pop Talk.
No, but for me, when I'm working out, I need a good podcast to distract me from my workout, because typically for me it's like 30 minutes of cardio, 30 minutes of strength training, and I mostly listen to music while I do strength training. But if I'm just on the treadmill or elliptical doing my little thing, that's when I like to listen to like Friends or podcasts.
Yeah. So I feel like we should transition into today's topic. Our conversation with Onyx was just incredible. And we have had so many incredible guests on this show, but Onyx just, she made me feel so empowered to kind of take charge of my own life. And this is something that I've been talking to Gianna with just quite a bit lately. And I've been listening to the Financial Feminist podcast by Her First 100K. I don't know if you've seen her on TikTok, on Instagram, but Tori, the host, is so amazing. And lately I've just been feeling like I really need to get a hold of my financial path, and especially being in this art world. Gianna, you and I have talked about being in debt before because of our degrees, and I feel like I'm at a place to really get serious about my future, about my finances, and I've been in kind of a panic mode about my career and how I'm going to sustain a living. And this isn't to negate everything that I'm very grateful for, but you know, with our conversation with Onyx, we talk about this stereotype that there's no path for career advances, for salary raises, that there's this stereotype about the art world where outsiders even know that we are not really making what we deserve to be making, even though the art world and museums function as a type of business. They are incredibly valuable culturally, but also hold a lot of value monetarily, which of course Gianna and I have also talked about in that, you know, art market episode. So I just felt so completely empowered by Onyx and our conversation, and we cannot wait to have her on again. We talked about leading a type of happy hour or a salary transparent workshop type event with her. It was so amazing. Gianna, do you have any thoughts? I thought we could also, after we finished recording, we kept talking, and we shared our salaries with Onyx too. So in the spirit of that, if we wanted to hit the ground running and be honest with everyone.
Yeah, there was a lot that we talked about with Onyx before and after we recorded, and I just met Onyx coincidentally, and we talk about that a little bit in our interview with her, but sometimes I feel like the stars align and you just meet people for the right reasons. And
it was truly such a blessing that we've been able to meet her. I mean, I just can't believe it.
Yeah, she is really such a gem and an incredible museum worker. But there was so much, and the art of an interview is a hard thing, and it's something Bianca and I have learned throughout this process on our own.
And are still
learning. But the amount of scenarios just running through my head that I have been through in my short-lived life and kind of working career experience, really just does want to make me cry. And the amount of things my fellow female colleagues have had to go through, and it's just really it's really astonishing. But aside from that, we did joke about having a scary Halloween episode about all this. We don't want this episode to be a downer. We want this episode to be more empowering, and we hope to have Onyx on and putting that energy out in the world. We'll have her on for future discussions to give everyone that platform to get those conversations out of their system and to share those effed things that have happened in the workplace. One of the things that we had talked about after recording that we didn't really get to in the interview was so much of an interview experience, and what I have been grappling this entire year is it's all about how do you fit into this role? How do you fit into this institution and this job role? And it's not the other way around. How does this place work for me? How do I feel about it? And it just is incredibly hard. And a little story is I just fairly recently, like a month or two ago, got done with a job interviewing experience to be a design coordinator for anthropology. And I did not get that job based off the criticism that they felt like I was too serious, and that they're just more of kind of like a fun going community there. And the things that I brought to the table in my 4 or 3 interviews I had with them, I was just too darn serious. So instead of like looking at that criticism as like, I don't even know like what that means, maybe that's right. Maybe I don't think that institution is a good fit for me, because maybe the things that I brought to the table, like talking about consumer experiences, is just on a different level that they're not interested in. But anyhow, I think that's a concept that we would like to explore further with Onyx. Another thing that we also didn't talk about too much was the idea that some job postings and the salaries that go with that are only feasible for people who have partners. And we were talking about an example, like a year ago, San Francisco Museum of Art posted a job description, and the pay, like you could not afford to live in San Francisco on your own based off that pay. I mean, people who live there now can barely afford to live there. It's such a high cost of living. And one of the reasons that I am able to move to Tulsa right now and move out of home, my childhood home, is because of having multiple incomes, because I'm moving in with my partner. So I have taken basically a docent position that, lucky enough, does pay $15 an hour, but it is part-time. And I have taken a pay cut from working full-time to part-time, but I was making $15 an hour at 21C Museum Hotel. With that being said, when I first took that job, I was making $11 an hour, and I had to advocate and ask for a higher pay, which in turn led to the entire kind of front desk staff that I was working with to have an increase in pay. So we were all able to then go up to $15 an hour. And it's that kind of simple aspect about asking and opening up things for conversation and dialogue that Onyx wants us to start empowering ourselves to have those conversations. And I've had a lot of experiences where I've tried to negotiate and it didn't go my way. But I was fortunate enough, at 21C to have an open dialogue with management that I did really respect, and in turn respected me, and it led to this really great outcome. There are just so many different scenarios and so many things running through my head, but that's where I am at currently. And I was able to take this job in Tulsa that I will be starting soon this week because of my significant other.
Going back to what you said, there are a million different things that were running through my head as we were talking to Onyx, and as we kind of talked about after the recording. It's almost unbelievable that 3 people who work in the same field had so many of these experiences at our age. And we are very fortunate to be able to kind of think about these now and be able to hopefully create better paths for us and for people working in our fields. So I think one of the biggest kind of revelations that I had while Onyx was talking was going back to what you said, Gianna, that idea of, does this institution work for you? And we go through this point in the conversation where Onyx is telling us about, we're talking about unpaid internships and how in your field, when you kind of study art and art history and you go through the academic setting, you are built and trained to think so highly of any museum who will offer you a position. And most of the time that position is going to be unpaid. All of the major art museums that we are taught to praise and lift up, and as Onyx will say, you should be lucky enough to get this get this position. You should be so grateful to have this. And I feel lately, and I have been feeling this like incredible sense of guilt for wanting more with my finances and for wanting to build myself a life that I envision. And her first 100K Financial Feminist podcast talks about this too, where women are taught to just feel grateful for what we have, but we add so much more value that men are advocating for themselves, and we are taught to not do that. We are taught to not advocate for not just what we want, but what we deserve, because we work hard for it. And it was such an encompassing conversation, and it led me to think about this time where I was offered what I thought was my dream internship. It was at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and they had offered me an internship, but it was unpaid. And I was devastated that I had to turn it down. And then people in my life, these kind of figures that at the time I thought were these kind of mentors to me, you know, were telling me things that felt like contradicting, like, oh yeah, you know what, if you would have taken that, like I know someone who took an internship there and they spent 8 years at that museum. And at the time I thought that was going to, you know, would have been the leaping point for my career. I mean, I thought that was going to break me, that I wasn't able to take this internship, but I couldn't do it because I just simply could not afford to live in Washington, D.C. without pay.
And the frustrating thing is the people who are able to take those kinds of positions either come from a really high point of privilege, or they're having to work extra hours somewhere else, or work a second job or a third job to also make ends meet.
And that's something that I've written about in my thesis as well. There's an article, I think it's Are Rich Kids the Only Ones Who Can Work in the Art World? And at a certain point, yes, that's very true. You have to either, like you said, come from privilege and wealth, or push yourself to no end to be able to make up the difference. So that was just such a, I don't know, like comforting, but at the same time, just like really eye-opening discussion that we have. And to go off of what you shared, Gianna, right now, I am making $40,000 a year, and I am $51,000 in student debt. So yeah, that is where I'm at. Yeah.
Just to also kind of end on these kind of encompassing themes, when you head over to Onyx's Instagram that we've linked, sharing this salary transparency project, a lot of conversation is centered on this aspect of fear. And before we get into the interview, I just want to add that fear is something that Bianca and I definitely kind of grapple with in having a platform like this. Throughout a job interviewing experience, I've been really fearful that having an outspoken podcast like Art Pop Talk has hindered my ability to get a full-time, decent paying job in the arts and nonprofit and in museums, because I've had several interviews with those platforms, and I feel like it's either, oh, I already have this other thing going on and therefore I can't dedicate my time to something else, or they have listened and it's too much. So with that being said, that aspect of fear that I've had personally is not to be a downer. It's just to say, being outspoken, whether it's in your institution or in your company or on your social media or a platform, like that fear is something that like we all experience. I experience fear in so many other different ways, like having a pre-existing condition. How is that going to affect me in the workplace? And these are things that we all deal with, and you know, Bianca and I aren't exempt from that.
Yeah. And I also don't want to diminish the fear that other people have as well. I think that fear is something that we can use to help others who have the same fear, right? So not everybody is in a position to feel like they have the power to be outspoken about this. So I think like that's another point that Art Pop Talk and this platform and what Onyx is doing is just so important, because we have the power to empower other people. And if we talk about that all the time on the podcast, like there's no point in talking about it unless we're going to, actually put it to use. So it's just but it is scary. It's very scary, because Gianna, I feel the same way. I mean, I've been putting Art Pop Talk on my resumes and things like that. And it's like, well, I truly don't feel like I'll ever work in a museum again, because I don't think that they would like this, what I'm saying, and the critiques that I have about museums. But two, I don't know if I know what I'm worth. And if they're not willing to pay me or provide me with what I am worthy of, then I don't know, not even worthy, but what you need, I don't like, museums just don't, this country does not know what it takes to live. And again, her first 100K, Financial Feminist, has been talking about it is expensive to be poor. And there are just so many other added costs of not having money. Like, so we'll link all of this. We are going to link Onyx's, all of her links directly in the show notes wherever you're listening. It is in the link in our Instagram, social media bios, and I'll also link all of the other people that we've talked about throughout this episode as well. So Onyx Montes is a museum educator, cultural worker, and salary transparency advocate. Onyx moved by herself to the U.S. from Mexico at the age of 17 and studied art history at the University of Washington in Seattle, and holds an MA in Museum and Exhibition Studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the first person in her family to graduate from college and is part of the inaugural Arts and Culture Leaders of Colors Fellowship by Americans for the Arts. Onyx has worked as a museum educator at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Museum of Contemporary Art of Chicago. She currently works as the social media manager for Hyde Park Art Center. 2 projects she is proud of include the art history workshops she taught for incarcerated women in Mexico, as well as the publication of anthology Artists and Their Snacks, which she edited in collaboration with the organization United States Artists. She's an avid reader and a solo traveler with 19 countries and counting under her belt. Everyone, you're just going to love Onyx so much. Please let us know what you think. Feel free to email us at artpoptalk@gmail.com, DM us, DM Onyx with all of your questions. And with that, enjoy. We'll talk to you next week. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are so excited to be joined today by Onyx Montes. Onyx, we are so glad and thankful that you are here with us today. So can you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell them a little bit about why you're on the show today?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Onyx Montes. I'm a social media manager and museum educator currently based in Chicago, and I'm here to talk about pay transparency and salary transparency in museums.
Yeek, we're so excited to have you. I ran into Onyx when I was working at the 21C in Oklahoma City, and you made me feel like such a cool kid because I was checking you into the hotel, and you were like, "Oh my gosh, are you Gianna from Art Pop Talk?" And I'm like, hi, are you an Art Pop Tart, you little cutie?" So we are really, really lucky to have you here today. So can you talk about the process that led you to choose this topic for your thesis? What about working in museums led you to this point?
The reason why I wanted to do this, focus on this topic, was because in 2019, I was denied a raise that I wanted. And in that, through that experience, leaving that room, after I had my annual review, leaving that room, it felt very sort of like, I don't know if anger is the right word, but I felt like I knew that this could be it could have been a better resolution. It could have been a process that would have been more of a collaboration instead of a thing that was just simply denied without any real explanation or thorough sort of like explanation of a pathway to how to get to this specific number that I wanted. And in addition to that, so that experience really made me feel inspired to think that I don't want anybody else in the future, whoever will take my job, to feel the way that I felt when I left that room. I didn't want this to happen to someone else. And I feel like if I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't be as passionate as I am about this topic. That was one part. The other part was that also in 2019, Kimberly Drew, who was the former social media manager at the Met, had a keynote talk at the American Alliance of Museums annual meeting in 2019. And in that talk, she describes how finding out that her predecessor had a higher salary than her throughout her time at the museum made her realize that she was being underpaid and that it was time for her to move on. Having that information allowed her to make that conscious decision for her and for her career. And similarly, so that's the second part. Similarly, the third part that sort of like completed the puzzle for me was that in 2019, partly inspired by that talk that Kimberly had, a group of people collectively known as the Art and Museum Transparency Collective put together a Google spreadsheet that was circulated in the summer of 2019, encouraging people and professionals in museums to put their data and their information as far as how much money they were making anonymously. And it really created a powerful tool to realize the vast discrepancies that there were across the board. There were people who, for instance, just focusing on roles that are closer to mine, social media managers making extremely vastly different numbers, and really eye-opening in many, many ways. I think it even went viral, and it was widely written about. And so that was really powerful for me. I also used that spreadsheet as a tool for me to come into that room during my annual review and sort of like have that information to show this is what I believe I should be making and sort of create a case for myself. So that was the sort of like the three parts that motivated me to focus on that, on this sort of like quest to be very vocal about transparency. And because I was going through my graduate program at the time, I decided to make it my capstone and use that as an opportunity to encourage other people to learn about it, talk about it, and connect with others like we're doing now. So that's really what started it.
And I'll just plug Kimberly Drew has a great little book, This Is What I Know About Art. And I think it's been out for maybe a little over a year now, but I'll link that as well. It's a really great little book that I'd recommend. But this is such a topic that has really been pushed to the forefront during COVID as well. And not that people weren't talking about it before COVID, obviously, but so I'm really excited that that you've been able to talk about this in the way that you have. Speaking of that, let's talk about the project and the information that you are promoting on Instagram. So how has the project evolved and what are its main goals for you?
The main goals are to encourage people of color in museums to talk about it, to become aware that one of the main reasons why, based on the research that I have, that I collected through a survey that I sent out in January of 2021, a lot of people are scared and fearful and sort of like afraid of retaliation. These museums and institutions are powerful and big and intimidating in many regards, not only for visitors, but also for people who work there. My goal is to encourage, even if I could just inspire one person to go into a room or to go up to their supervisor or to talk to their coworkers and have these conversations. I feel like that is amazing. And that is really my goal, because I was in that situation. I've made several mistakes and I have learned in many ways the hard way, but I am determined to look at the numbers, look at the data, for instance, thinking about the role of people of color in museums, the role of women in museums, and realize that there are tangible things like the pay gap that continue to impact our lives, and also that there are people who are being denied raises, or people who maybe perhaps without having this information, or really being maybe a little nervous, don't really go for it and ask for more. And that to me reflects as leaving money on the table. And so that is my main goal, to encourage people in museums to be more vocal, to have these conversations, and to challenge that sense of being afraid. Right now the project is online. There will be a PDF version where people can download the project and really get a lot more of like the meat, I guess, of the project, and the heart of the research, so they can have tangible things they can say, phrases they can use, ways to look at numbers and data so that they can make a case for themselves. What happens if they are rejected or if they say no? Things that could happen during the interview process. All of those things that I think, because they're more tailored to museums, I hope that they will find it useful. And I also have been posting some of the survey findings that I had or collected through the survey. And one of the main things that surprised me was that also a lot of museum professionals, workers, cultural workers were not aware of their protections under the NLRA, which is the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. And because they don't know that we are protected to have these conversations, they are kind of shying away from having them. I also have a story, which I don't know if this would be the right moment to tell you, but in April, so about 2 months ago, my organization had a session where we have been talking about different kinds of equity topics. So during one session, we talk about hiring processes. Another session, we talk about salary and benefits. And during this salary and benefits conversation that we had staff-wide, it was like a staff meeting, a group presented sort of like where we are in comparison to other organizations, like how much money we're making in comparison to other cultural organizations in Chicago, but also within the neighboring region. And one of the things that I asked during this meeting was, what is it that is preventing us from being transparent as an organization? What is it that is limiting us really from us having these conversations and realize where we are as an organization internally? And the response that I got from leadership was that perhaps that would be something that could be maybe uncomfortable for some, and maybe not really welcome for the group. And I use the chat box as a tool to let everyone know in that room that we're all legally protected from having these conversations amongst ourselves, amongst the staff. And I invited everyone to read that in the comments, and I said, I will share my salary, and I'll start. I think at the time I was making 41K. I said, my salary is 41K. And once I put that comment in the chat box, I could see everyone sort of like, kind of like a surprised, but I think I was the one that was the most surprised, because once I put the comment in the chat box and I revealed how much I'm making, 27 out of the 30 people on staff followed and shared their salary. So it was sort of like a great moment that revealed to us that those ideas of, we don't really talk about money here, can be challenged. And I know that I took a big risk, and I know that it was nerve-wracking, but I felt like it was necessary, because after a whole year of navigating a pandemic with salary freezes, with hiring freezes as well, it was urgent. And to me, these conversations of let's see where we are and let's continue the conversation and let's just kind of go around and not really have any action, it was important for me to challenge that. So I use the chat box as a way to be like, just so everyone knows, we have this federal protection, and I'm going to go and share how much I'm making. And even, our executive director shared, and it was something that I think it was more than anything an eye-opening, galvanizing moment. And as a result, we all got raises within 3 weeks. That process wouldn't have happened as fast if that hadn't been the case. And I guess like the reason why I wanted to share this is because it only takes oftentimes one person or a group of people to take that step and be like, I'm going to challenge this fear. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to have these conversations. And we are protected from retaliation from these kinds of instances. And so that was something that was very eye opening for me and taught me a lot. I also, another way that I had in the past challenged this idea of like being afraid of retaliation or kind of being secretive is that I put how much money I make on my Instagram bio where anybody can go and see how much I'm making. Because to this day, there isn't a museum in the US, to my knowledge, that is salary transparent. And so I'm hoping that soon that won't be the case anymore. But until then, I will make every effort to be open and you know, there isn't any shame in saying how much I'm making, because I want to encourage also people who are listening to realize that how much money you make does not equal how much you're worth. And so once you have that separation, it's easy to talk about these things without feeling like, you know, if I'm denied this raise, it means I'm not good enough, or it means my work is not good enough, or I mean, you know. So yeah, it was, these are two examples of, you know, little things that perhaps, I know they're, I guess I don't mean like little things, but like steps that people can consider. And it was a very eye opening moment for me, and I'm really proud that, you know, I was able to experience leadership, hearing, and also realizing that based on all of us sharing our salaries in that chat box, we realized just how much of a gap we had. The group that presented the summary of the salary and benefits and kind of where we were and the analysis forgot to look at the pay gap with a lens on women with for our own organization. And so there wasn't any really attention focus on that. And so I said this needs to happen, because we need to know within our organization what are the gaps, not only in terms of position but also in terms of gender. So I think it was a great moment for all of us, and I'm proud that out of something kind of scary, you know, the outcome was a positive one.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And you're so right in the sense that it really just takes one conversation. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's breaking down the politeness of it all, and which is just a construct that we have made up to benefit the institution. But speaking of the
Well,
institution,
for men to
mm-hmm,
benefit from, because women are not taught to
mm-hmm,
talk about money, and we are not supposed to talk about money.
mm-hmm.
And so I just gotta plug that. It's meant for men to make more money than us, and for people of color.
Right,
Of course.
right.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. And most times when I leave an institution, which has been twice since in the pandemic, I especially make it a point to let my colleagues know, you know, how much I'm making, if I know that we are making different monies, so they know that they can negotiate and be paid for more. But always conversations for later. But I do want to get back to that institution that we love and don't love. So you said that there's not an institution in the United States right now with your research that is completely salary transparent. How do you envision museums and artistic environments reach that point, and how that will look like and how that will be sustained?
Yes, there isn't any, to my knowledge, institution that is fully salary transparent. The way I envision a museum being transparent is hopefully that museums can look at case studies or perhaps other organizations that are already transparent and learn from the models they have adopted. Two case studies or two enterprises that I've looked at in my research, they're not art related, but they are transparent, fully transparent, and can offer, I think, lessons for museums to adopt, or I guess perhaps create a model that works for them. One of them is Buffer, which is a software platform that allows you to schedule social media posts, and they are fully salary transparent. The way that they adopted their model was to match their transparent model to their mission and their values. They started off with a formula, which I think museums should look into, and I talk about this in my research. And I use the idea of like, what would it be like for someone like me living in Chicago, having these many years of experience with this much of a cost of living, and how it changes every year as a percentage, and that creates like a base salary with like a percentage of like living expenses plus maybe loyalty or years of experience as another factor, to look at a formula that can give you a certain number that is more equitable than a depressed wage that stays the same. And that is one way that Buffer has looked at their model, which I think it's really clever. They're also fully salary transparent, which means that anybody can go into the website and download I believe it's like an Excel spreadsheet where you can see how much money they're making and how they have modified their formula throughout the years. The first formula they adopted was in 2013. The other enterprise that I've looked at is Molly Moon's in Seattle, one of my favorite ice cream shops. Women owned. They became salary transparent in 2019, April of 2019. And they're not fully salary transparent in the sense that you can go online and find exactly how much each scooper makes, but they have an internal model that is transparent where every employee can know how much, maybe another staff member working in a different ice cream shop in Seattle is making. And one of the things that they discovered as they were preparing to become transparent was that they spent a year making audits, talking to each staff member. Molly Neitzel, who is the CEO, talked to every person on staff, and that took a long time, and described why they were making this transition, exactly how much they were going to be making and why, what factors were involved, and that took a whole year. And that time invested into that process was critical because as part of that, they, had audits that let them know that certain shops were bringing in more money than others. As a result, some people who were working in these ice cream shops were making more money than others. Perhaps because of the location, they were more heavily trafficked. And they decided as a result of that to ban tips, raise the price of the ice cream, and raise the wages. So it became like a more equitable model for all. And I really like that. And I know that perhaps it doesn't translate immediately into a museum position, but I think that looking at what things can be switched and modified within museums to look at the budget and to make the budget more flexible instead of rigid, to account for things like emergencies, like pandemics, like major things that could impact salaries for staff, I think it's important. And so those two are two case studies that I encourage leadership in museums and also staff within museums to look at and realize if there are the many ways that maybe those models could be used as inspiration. I know that the National Public Housing Museum in Chicago is looking at a formula. I know that the organizations that I'm involved in are, we're having these conversations, and as a result of what happened in the chat box comment, we're looking at hiring a committee that can help us look at, okay, what are some things that could be more equitable as we move forward with a more transparent model. And so I'm glad that these things are happening. And that is what I envision. I envision hopefully museums actually being proud and being embracing these ideas because they're urgent and they're so necessary, and really it's more of a collaboration. It really takes both sides of the table to make sustainable and durable and I guess like more permanent change.
It's very interesting to me to like hear some of those concepts and like some of those other case studies, because when I think of something like big business, or I talk with my partner Theben about this all the time. He works in corporate America and he has access to not names, but positions and companies and what those peoples with those titles make. And he has access to that information and it's pretty public. So it's really funny to me, hysterical, when museums and artists feel and are put in the separate category from like big business and corporate America, which is really not the case. And yet there's this transparency happening, or at least this tangible kind of archive of salary happening in other places that we also think are completely screwed up. And yet we still have the stigma of museums being so democratic. You know, it's the same stigma when we get artists being separated from entrepreneurs, when we get museums, institutions separated from other kind of corporate life settings. So it's hysterical. Like,
Yeah. And I find it really fascinating that the people in museums who are taking care of, caring for, and protecting the artwork on the walls, not just like our cultures, not just programming, and not just community enrichment and the the livelihood that art provides for people, but the millions and billions of dollars that are placed and on the value of things hanging in the wall. Yet and we talk about that all the time, like it's normal. Like we talk like the Salvador Mundi piece, like that was international news, the value of an artwork, and yet we cannot publicly talk about the value of the people who protect those artworks.
and we make them sign NDAs
Yeah, well,
when we lay them off.
Connected with that too is like, I want to also think about what would it be like to have, instead of a fancy curatorial position named after a, you know, whoever is sponsoring that job, the whatever curatorial fellow or whatever, or the whatever director, like what would it be like if instead we could have somebody like that, like a, whether it's like a somebody who provides funding for a position in maintenance or in housekeeping or in visitor services after such the same kind of renowned name. Why is it that so many curatorial and director positions are named after, you know, people who provide funding for those roles, and yet we don't have the same for people who work in maintenance and visitor services, or people who are on the floor directly connecting with visitors, educators, who were one of the most affected roles in the pandemic. So it's another thing that we can think about as well and challenge. Why is it that only certain positions get the funding, and the more permanent roles that, you know, really differ when it comes to other roles that are more like security guards, who are often not even affiliated with museums and are contracted and not able to have full benefits. So that's another thing too that just reminded me. I was reminded of when you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this next question feeds really well into that, because I love what you said about like there is a very urgent need for this. It is a crisis happening in the art world and the museum world right now. And I think it's interesting how much the people who work in those spaces can really feel that. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you recommend for people who are working in the arts or who want to work in the arts? We're talking about those people who have suffered through unpaid internships and are going through this grueling unpaid labor for no payout. And I think Gianna and I struggle with this too. Like, how can we keep rationalizing this? Like, we love the field and we love the work and we're so passionate about it, but like where do we draw the line? So can you talk about like how people can rationalize this type of career path with what we're seeing right now, wage and salary wise, and even like Gianna and I have talked about with outsourcing, like you mentioned with security people, like they're not even getting paid benefits by their museums anymore. How can we continue to support that?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the time when I was also doing a lot of unpaid internships and a lot of unpaid labor, and one of the things that I decided to do was to stop applying to unpaid internships, and I made a promise to myself that I would only take paid internships, that I would only take projects that would be paid, and that I would be always keeping in mind that I'm operating against myself and we're operating against each other if we don't advocate or negotiate for pay. So, for instance, I heard there was once a comment that I heard somebody mention saying in regards to internships, unpaid internships, where if you have an unpaid internship opportunity that you really want, but it's, you know, unpaid, one thing you could think about is having a conversation with whoever will be your supervisor and have a conversation that where you describe, okay, I will be able to, or I'm interested in taking this internship for X amount of time or however long this internship is, but I really want to have a conversation with you during this time or in 1 month or 3 months or however long, and explore the possibilities of a paid opportunity further along or after the internship. And I think that even having that conversation shows that you're not afraid to ask for a paid opportunity or to challenge this idea that your labor shouldn't be paid, because that's such a antiquated belief that unfortunately still so many organizations are operating with or using to exploit people. Another thing that is also important to me is that recently there was a time when I was offered a job, and the job didn't pay what it's Cynthia Carson from Wager calls your walkaway number. She mentions that a lot, your walkaway number. And when you have that walkaway number and you don't get that offer, you get your an offer that's below your walkaway number, what do? Because you really want this job, and you really you love the work, you love the organization, the mission, and what do? And so one of the things that has been very eye-opening for me this last year is that, similarly to what I felt the day that I had my raise denied, I feel like I would be doing myself, I would be hurting myself and hurting others if I took a job that didn't pay what I was worth. And so I decided to walk away. And that was really tough. But I think that in the end, it was the best thing I could do, because if I continue to accept a salary that is depressed or that is not meeting my needs, then I'm not helping anyone. And I decided to walk away. And that was very, again, in many ways, like life changing for me. I decided not to take less than what I think I deserve and what I know I deserve. And so I would say those two things are two pieces of advice that I would recommend people to consider. And I know it's really hard because there's a lot of this mentality in museums to be grateful for whatever you can get, to get your foot in the door, or to feel like you're so lucky to work in a museum. And that's true, but also don't forget the other side where they're also lucky to have you. Don't go into an interview thinking, oh my God, like, are they going to like me? Like, you also need to remember, are you going to like them? Is this a museum or an organization where you can see yourself being supported, and also whose values and mission align to your own? So that other side of the coin was never discussed in my art history classes, was never discussed in internships. It was always like I remember going into my first like big internship at the Met in 2016, and I was so, blown away, and I was so excited, and it was great. But I remember my mentality was, I can't believe I'm here, and and that was very nice. But I think that it was an incomplete mindset, I guess, in the sense that it shouldn't be like, I can't believe I'm here, and like maybe I'm never gonna have this chance again, or no. It's like, just go for it, be confident in your work, and be confident that other opportunities will come. And maybe you'll have to wait a little bit, or the process is not going to be smooth, or you're going to have to apply and get rejected. But that persistence, every single interview that you go, every single job that maybe you don't get, or raise that you don't get, will prepare you for that moment where you're fully confident that this is the one that was right for you, and celebrating that. And so I would also encourage everyone to not beat themselves up too much, because I know that can be also like a big thing where you beat yourself up and you're like, oh my God. That is also another thing that I want to tell people who are listening, to not feel like it's the end of the world. If you don't get the job, or if you get rejected, the more that you negotiate, the more that you go into interviews, you don't get it, look at it as a practice for your next interview where you're going to get that job.
Onyx, you did touch on this earlier, but we want to dive in a little bit deeper. If you can talk about just a little bit how the wage gap plays into your project as well, and how women of color in particular are more effective in these creative fields, as we just discussed.
One of the things that really motivate me to keep going with this project is the pay gap, especially because one of the most recent information that we have nationwide comes from 2018 and talks about how the pay gap stands at 18%, where women collectively make about 82 cents to a man's dollar. And this varies widely between different, people of different ethnicities. And so, for instance, white women make 79 cents to a man's dollar. For Asian American women, that is 90 cents to a man's dollar. Black women make 62 cents. Native American and Pacific Islander women make 57 cents. And unfortunately, the lowest paid rate that we have is for Latina women, who are making 54 cents to a man's dollar. So as a Latina woman, this is very important to me to be vocal about why the pay gap is such an important thing that we need to discuss, why this is so urgent, and why, if you think about someone who looks like me over the course of her career, the amount of money that I will be missing is tremendous in comparison to, a white person, for example, or a white man. And so to me, this is what is at the heartbeat of it all, is like, we need to challenge this idea that women shouldn't ask, or that these things aren't real, like the pay gap doesn't exist, or when we know that there are things that we also need to challenge. For example, not just the pay gap, but what does it mean to have a pay gap that impacts not only women of color, but people with disabilities. In the US, for example, there are regulations that allow for people with disabilities to be paid less or below minimum wage. And this is something that oftentimes employers use to take advantage of that and pay people less. So what does it look like for people with disabilities, who are people of color, who live in the margins of, different identities? And we don't have enough research to shed light on all these different factors. But it is huge for us to have these conversations, because it really lets us know in the vast disparities that we have between people of color, especially women of color. I talk about, for instance, in the as part of my survey, one of the questions that relates a little bit to this has to do with, as somebody who works in museums, knowing that your work is often underpaid, considering things like the gender pay gap, considering things like the high cost of living, or things that happen like the pandemic and all of the ramifications that come with that, have you considered leaving the museum sphere for a higher paying field? And based on the data that I got, 79.6% of the survey respondents said they would, and only 20% said they wouldn't. So it's really sad for me that we have things like the gender pay gap that we don't really talk about as much, things like depressed wages, things like people who are being underpaid and overworked, and the fact that so many people would even consider leaving because it's just too much and it's too overwhelming to keep working within a field that really doesn't value its workers the same. Michelle Miller Fisher talked about how it's important to look at institutions not just as places that protect and house objects, but it should be museums and institutions that are for people first and objects second. And I really think that is really at the heartbeat of why I think talking about the gender pay gap as a Latina woman and all the money that we would be missing out over the course of our careers is huge. And so that is one thing that really, I think, it's like a burning sensation that really like helps me move forward with this. So yeah, those are unfortunately the statistics that I have.
Having conversations with people online, actually in our TikTok feed, and it's really interesting. I think people are very quick to kind of casually say like, oh, yep, like now I work in PR, or now I work in marketing, or now I work in something else. And it feels just like this thing that just happens. Like the lifespan of an art historian is that you major in art history and then eventually you can't sustain it and you move on to something else. And unfortunately, I feel very much like I'm in that position right now. And I wanted to talk to you a little about like that outsider perspective as well. So I think a lot of the times there is this like, it's an art history, and the people who work in that field or in museums and creative fields in general, it's a joke, right? Like it's seen as a hobby from the outside. There are several, clips from television shows and movies about making fun of, people who work in museums, how like they make $22,000 a year and like their life is really hard. And it's the butt of the joke to everyone else who, isn't involved in that, right? So I wanted to ask if you could kind of speak to those people, or the people that obviously work in the museums as well, but like what can we all do to bring other awareness to this, but also kind of stop putting on this facade like, oh haha, like yeah, my poor paycheck is funny, like that's great, haha. Like how do we move on from being the butt of the joke all the time in like kind of the larger outside realm of all of the people who visit and patron the museums, right?
Yeah. One thing that I also want to emphasize when it comes to that question is that most museums in the US don't get their money from the government. And so, as a result of that, we're subject to market forces just as any other business. And so, in order to bring in revenue and attract visitors, we have to provide these new experiences, and but all of those experiences and all of those things that come into like, let's bring visitors in with like the next dinosaur blockbuster show or whatever, they don't take into account real life changing and impactful policies that I think we really should be talking more about. So, for example, the fact that I myself now identify as a museum worker instead of a museum professional, for example. And the reason why I do that is because I want to have more of a solidarity with people who work the floor, who clean those floors, who sell those tickets, or who are security guards. And if I call myself a professional, it just kind of feels like that joke that you were alluding to. This idea that we are professionals, yet we're professionals with paychecks that don't reflect that professionalism, or uh, or we're professionals, but we're struggling to make ends meet and working like 3 or 4 jobs just to make it work. So I think that one way to challenge that idea of like our work being perhaps undervalued is to advocate for higher pay, to also embrace the uncomfortable feelings that come with having these conversations with others, because we need to realize that once we start having these conversations, even if we get rejected, even if we get shut down, I think that it builds solidarity that if not in that organization where you were shut down or you were silenced, you will find it in another one. And there is a reward on the other side of moving through that ask for better working conditions or better pay, or also wanting to have conversations that relate to what we were talking about earlier, the gender pay gap, and why that is so prominent, and the causes for that oftentimes is we don't really stop to look at the policies that an organization might have, like maternity leave or paternity leave. Oftentimes things that perpetuate the gender pay gap have to do a lot with women not being able to advance at the same rate as men, because oftentimes women have to bear the burden or the responsibility, I should say, carry the responsibility of family care, child care, or caring for a parent, or caring for the family at a rate that is disproportionate to men. I would encourage people to embrace the fact that our work has value, that whenever you are in an organization or thinking about applying to another job, to change your mentality from this idea of, will they like me? And instead think, will I like them also? It's not just they're lucky to have, I'm lucky sorry, it's not only I'll be so lucky to get this job, but instead they'll be so lucky to have me as well. I don't see my work, and I don't want people to think that our work is easy or not as challenging just because it's artsy or whatever. Because there's a lot of, as you all know, of creative output that we have to constantly be thinking about, connecting the dots between history and technology. You are talking about TikTok and how many museums now are using TikTok. How many museums are connecting through audiences in a virtual realm through the pandemic and have been able to access audiences that maybe they hadn't before. So the pace is really fast, and I think that fast-pacedness, people who work in museums are really well suited to really adapt to, because we have, in many ways, been used to multitask and have to work under conditions that, where we don't have all the things that we need, and we just have to create things sometimes out of nothing, or under very little with very little, we can make a lot. And I think that that is something that I respect, and that is something that, you know, to me reflects as imaginative, smart, and creative. And those things, I know that they're not usually prioritized in corporate or businessy like jobs, but I think that those are the kinds of things that have really inspired so many people to create something that is new and life changing. And so to me, that has a lot of value. And I just hope that museums really, people in museums and leadership in museums really pay attention to that. That instead of maybe funding another wing, they use that money to instead pay their workers a fair wage.
Going back to what you were talking about earlier and kind of how you address yourself as a museum worker versus a museum professional, I find really fascinating because this year for me has been post-graduation, time to find a big girl job, time to stop being so hard on myself about, finding a big girl job. But how do I now define the work that I am doing out of a traditional 9 to 5 setting? Enter Art Pop Talk. How do I personally not refer to the work that I'm doing outside of my 9 to 5 or full-time job as a side hustle, and personally not refer to it in destructive terms as well and degrade myself? In the beginning of doing something like Art Pop Talk, or now that I have left that warm embrace of academia because it is such a bubble, how do I then go and tell my colleagues when I was working in non-traditional art settings that I have this other work, and then I'm just pegged as, this art girl, and, oh, I do these fun other things on the side and they're just hobbies. So it was really fascinating how to hear you work through how you want to address yourself in your title within the museum world, because that's been something I've been really personally grappling with this year. Going back to our earlier conversation, though, your posts thus far on your Instagram page have really focused on this idea of the fear of it all that we have when we share our salaries. And you ask us on Instagram, quote, what are some reasons you are or are not open to sharing your salaries with others? So this question posing fear in relation to women's work experiences is something that I've been discussing a lot this year, and the knowledge that I have discovered is that the fear is rooted in the constructed politeness. It's not polite to discuss your salary. It's not cute to discuss your salary. So now, can we discuss some of the reasons or some of the responses you have gained when it comes to this idea of fear?
The great majority of the responses that I got through the survey have to do with fear of retaliation. They have to do with the fear of being seen as ungrateful, being seen as somebody who is a traitor. It's sort of like, biting the hand that feeds you kind of thing. So all those things I want to emphasize only benefit one side of the coin, I guess I would say. They only benefit one kind of person or one kind of team, and that is often, people in leadership who don't, I don't want to paint them as like vile and terrible, but they're not beneficial to us who are museum workers. And some of the responses that I can share include, I believe that none of us are paid fairly, and I want those who make less than me to know where they stand and are able to use that information to negotiate for better pay for themselves. Another response says, I am embarrassed that I'm 35 and making so little money in a professional role that I fought hard to get in. Another one says, I work at 2 places and colleagues of mine have been paid incorrectly for months and even years at a time. Having never discussed their salary with other colleagues is so infuriating. Another one says, I believe salary transparency is essential. I would talk about it, but feel embarrassed that it's so low. I feel underpaid and overworked. Another one says there's very little room for change in the organization, and if it happens, it will probably take years. This has all been long periods of frustration. Low salary, no benefits, grant-funded curatorial assistant position, and I worry that I'm not doing enough. I was taught that it was rude and inappropriate to talk about pay. I don't talk about it because it would be threatening to my job and board members. Others are not as comfortable talking about pay. I do not share because of fear of judgment, feelings of guilt and shame, fear of retaliation from leadership. My salary is embarrassingly low at 14 an hour. So as you can see, there's all these different comments that reflect fear, shame, guilt, and it's in many ways sad that so many of us who, as you have mentioned, we all come into this field because we genuinely believe in it. We love art. We love to talk about art and connect with people because we really believe in the power of art. And when I read these kinds of comments, it really makes me, I don't want to say it brings me down, but instead it motivates me to keep talking. And hopefully one of those, people who maybe shared the way that they feel ashamed because they're making so little can hear this or can hopefully learn to advocate for themselves and for the field as a whole. Every time that we decline a job offer that is too low, or every time that we decline an unpaid internship or a gig that is unpaid, I feel like we're taking a stand. And so I'm hoping that little by little, museum workers can also feel inspired to take a stand and feel inspired to be more transparent. I really also want to shout out the work of emerging museum professionals and their initiatives, the things that they have done for the field to be more transparent. For instance, the Google form that they have, when anytime that someone wants to apply for a job and they find a job posting that doesn't have the salary range or the salary info, you can fill out that form and they will reach out to that museum on your behalf anonymously and ask them to provide that information. And and that is like another way to think about what does it look like for museum and museum employees to take a stand and to demand that information, which only benefits everyone and avoids this time wasted of applying for a job you don't even know you can afford. And if there are people out there who work in museums or HR, to also think about the hiring process and job postings as a way to make it more equitable for all, and post the salary information in every job posting. It saves so much time, and it's something that is a very tiny step that can easily be taken. So those things, I know I can go on and on, but those things are some of the responses I've gotten, and the things that I think about when I look at or think about the responses that people have, feelings of fear, shame, and guilt.
Oh, this is like, I feel like I want to cry. Just, it's so overwhelming, but it at the same time, I feel like it brings me a lot of joy that, we're three women here having this conversation. And I hope that it is leading to something bigger. And that brings me a lot of hope, just even hearing all the people who have been so kind enough to respond to your surveys too. So we like to end on a light note here at our pop talk. So I know I feel like, I feel tense. I feel like I gotta go like revolt against the museum. But if money was no object, just for fun, what is one work of art that you would pay sky high prices, market value, like buy it at Sotheby's? What is one work of art that you would pay for?
I would pay for Lilith by Kiki Smith, Met
Yes.
Museum
Whoa.
collection. And I think it relates to this. The first time I saw Lilith was in 2016. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, I encourage you all, if you're able to, or at some point, to visit the Met Museum, the modern contemporary wing. In Jewish mythology, Lilith was Adam's first wife. And unlike Eve, Lilith was created from the earth, the same earth as Adam was created. So Lilith always saw herself as Adam's equal and refused to be submissive or subservient to Adam. And because of this defiant attitude and her wanting to be independent and be her own self, she escaped Eden or paradise. And so Lilith, the sculpture is a sculpture that's bronze, is in many ways rough, and you can, when you look at it, it's not really polished. It has this sort of like rough surface. The bronze is sort of like has this tactile quality, and Lilith is sort of like perched on the wall as you go into the second floor of the Met Museum, and it can take you by surprise. It's presence that is enigmatic and unexpected, but very powerful. And the pose of the sculpture, the body, is sort of like about, as if Lilith is about to jump and maybe escape, or in sort of like a pose that is like about to attack. And I love that artwork. It's one of my favorites. So that would be definitely the artwork that I would select, because I think it reflects this idea of women oftentimes expected to be quiet, polite, and not take enough room, or sort of like be grateful and submissive. And I really can relate to Lilith and her spirit of defiance and of wanting more and wanting to escape a limiting environment. So that's definitely the artwork that I would select.
Fantastic, fantastic choice. I love Lilith. I always go back to that idea of the untamed woman, and I think we are all untamed women here today, so it definitely fits the vibe. Onyx, we are so happy and so grateful that you were able to take the time to join us for a conversation today. Before we let you go, is there anything else that you want to plug, and where can people find you?
Thank you so much for having me. I want to end also on this note that, there were many times when I was working on this project that I worried about, as somebody who, if in the near future I'm applying for another job, or I'm applying for other opportunities, if I would be seen as someone who is, like a troublemaker, or maybe someone who would be like, too vocal about transparency, pay transparency, and I worried about that. And I think that comes from this idea of all the fear that we talked about earlier. In that, I decided to still go forward with this, because I know that wherever I go next, I know that whatever organization I might work or collaborate with will also have the same kind of values that I have. And so there isn't a need for me to hide. There isn't a need for me to be fearful, because this is not, I don't really see this as like me against museums or workers against museums. I really see this as, let's all recognize that this is urgent. Let's all recognize that this is important. And let's all recognize that this can be a collaborative effort instead of a combative thing. So with that, I hope that people can follow the project at Salary Transparency on Instagram. I am also on Instagram, my personal Instagram, at Onyx Montes. And that's where I oftentimes post a lot of my research, my findings, and things that are inspirational for others that relate to negotiation and transparency. So those would be the places where people can find me.
You all know where to find us. Instagram, we're going to link all of Onyx's resources on our resources page through our website and through our Insta. Please like, follow, share, all that fun stuff. And we will talk to you all next Tuesday. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Art Pop Talks executive producers are me, Bianca Martucci-Fink.
And me, Gianna Martucci-Fink.
Music and sounds are by Josh Turner, and photography is by Adrian Turner.
And our graphic designer is Sid Hammond.